Summit in Addis Ababa. Burkina Faso's revolutionary leader, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, just called out one of Africa's longest-serving presidents in front of the entire continent. The room went silent. Cameras stopped rolling. This wasn't diplomacy. This was a reckoning. And what Traoré said next sent shockwaves across every capital from Cairo to Cape Town. Stay with me, because what unfolded in those 11 minutes will change how we see African leadership forever. It was supposed to be a routine session on economic development and regional cooperation. 54 nations gathered under the grand dome of the African Union headquarters, their flags hanging in perfect symmetry, their leaders seated in carefully arranged hierarchies of power and influence. President Yoweri Museveni of Uganda, now in his fourth decade of rule, was scheduled to deliver remarks on infrastructure development and investment opportunities in East Africa. The 79-year-old statesman has become a fixture at these gatherings, his presence as predictable as the sunrise over the Rift Valley. But something was different this time. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the 36-year-old leader who seized power in Burkina Faso through a popular military coup just 2 years ago, had requested an unexpected slot to respond. The AU Secretariat, perhaps underestimating the young captain's intentions, granted the request. They shouldn't have. When Traoré approached the podium, he wasn't wearing the tailored suits favored by his peers. He wore his military fatigues, the same uniform he'd worn when he rallied his people against corruption and foreign exploitation. His red beret sat firmly on his head, a symbol that has come to represent a new generation of African resistance. He carried no notes. No teleprompter scrolled before him. What came next was raw, unscripted, and absolutely unprecedented. President Museveni, Traoré began, his voice steady but sharp as a blade. You have been in power since I was -2 years old. Before I was even born, you promised the people of Uganda progress, prosperity, and liberation from tyranny. 38 years later, I stand here and ask you a simple question. Where is that progress? Where is that prosperity? The silence in that hall was deafening. Diplomats shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Ugandan delegation members stared straight ahead, their faces frozen in careful neutrality. Museveni himself sat motionless, his expression unreadable behind his signature glasses and cowboy hat. But Traoré wasn't finished, not even close. You promised your people infrastructure, Traoré continued, his words gaining momentum like a gathering storm. Yet after nearly 4 decades, over 70% of rural Ugandans still lack access to reliable electricity. You promised them health care, but maternal mortality rates remain among the highest on the continent. You promised them education, but millions of children still learn under trees because there aren't enough classrooms. He paused, letting the weight of each statistic settle over the assembly like dust after an explosion. But here's what bothers me most, Mr. President. It's not just that you failed to deliver on these promises. It's that you stopped them from happening. You didn't just stall progress. You actively prevented it. Anyone who dared to challenge your vision, anyone who offered an alternative path was labeled an enemy of the state. Opposition leaders imprisoned, journalists silenced. Young people who dared to dream of something different were met with tear gas and bullets. According to sources inside the AU chamber, you could hear every breath in that moment. The usual diplomatic chatter, the rustling of papers, the whispered translations, all of it stopped. Africa's young lions and old guards alike were witnessing something they'd never seen before. One African leader holding another publicly accountable, not with Western talking points or colonial frameworks, but with African values of Ubuntu, of collective responsibility, of honoring the ancestors and protecting the future. Traoré shifted his stance, and his tone became even more pointed. You see, President Museveni, you and I both came to power through the barrel of a gun. The difference is this. I promised my people I would use that power to dismantle the systems that keep us enslaved to foreign interests and corrupt elites. You promised the same thing in 1986. But somewhere along the way, you became exactly what you fought against. You became the strongman. You became the ruler who changes constitutions to stay in power. You became the leader who measures success by how long you can hold on to your seat rather than how much you can uplift your people. The Ugandan delegation, we're told, began quietly gathering their materials. Several members looked toward the exits, but Museveni remained seated, his face now visibly tense, jaw clenched beneath his graying beard. What made Traoré's speech so devastating wasn't just the passion, it was the precision. He came armed with facts that cut through decades of carefully constructed narratives. Let me give you numbers that don't lie, Traoré declared, pulling a small folded paper from his pocket. In 1986, when you took power, Uganda's GDP per capita was approximately $300. Today, after 38 years of your leadership, it stands at just over $900. That sounds impressive until you realize that during that same period, Rwanda went from total devastation to over $800 per capita in just 30 years under completely different leadership. Ethiopia, despite its challenges, has quadrupled its GDP per capita. Even my own Burkina Faso, despite being landlocked and facing terrorism, has seen more proportional growth in the last decade than Uganda has under your entire tenure. He didn't stop there. Traoré referenced a recent African Development Bank report, a real document that showed Uganda's infrastructure development ranking had actually declined relative to its regional neighbors over the past 15 years. He cited Transparency International figures showing Uganda's corruption perception index had worsened, not improved, under Museveni's watch. He mentioned the controversial oil deals with multinational corporations that promised billions in revenue but delivered pennies to ordinary Ugandans. Official government sources in Kampala claim that foreign direct investment has increased, Traoré said, his voice dripping with controlled anger. But expert analysts at the African Economic Research Consortium have shown that over 60% of that investment goes directly to projects controlled by military-linked companies and government-connected firms. The people see nothing. The youth inherit nothing. The future gets mortgaged again and again while you and your inner circle secure your dynasties. This was the moment that truly electrified the room. Traoré wasn't just criticizing policy, he was exposing a system, a pattern that many African nations recognized in their own contexts. But then Traoré did something unexpected. He pivoted. I don't say this to humiliate you, President Museveni, his tone softening just slightly. I say this because Uganda deserves better, Africa deserves better, and perhaps most importantly, because there was a time when you understood this. There was a time when you were the revolutionary, when you spoke truth to power, when you challenged the old order and inspired millions across this continent. He referenced Museveni's own speeches from the 1980s and 90s, quoting the Ugandan leader's famous words about African solutions to African problems, about rejecting neo-colonialism, about building genuine democracy. The irony hung in the air like smoke from a doused fire. What happened to that man? Traoré asked, and for the first time there was something almost mournful in his voice. What happens to revolutionaries when they taste power for too long? Do we all eventually become the oppressors we once fought against? This is my fear, Mr. President. This is why I have pledged to my people in Burkina Faso that I will not follow your path. This is why I have committed to a transition back to civilian rule within 5 years, no matter what. Because I have seen what happens when leaders confuse their personal survival with national progress. The cameras in the chamber, official AU photographers, captured something remarkable in that moment. Several older leaders nodded almost imperceptibly. Younger delegates sat forward in their seats, and Museveni, for just a fraction of a second, seemed to look away. Protocol dictated that Museveni should have the opportunity to respond. The AU chairperson offered him the floor. But in a move that stunned everyone present, the Ugandan president simply stood, adjusted his iconic hat, and walked out of the chamber. His entire delegation followed in hurried silence, their footsteps echoing through the grand hall like a retreat. It was, according to veteran AU observers, unprecedented. In 40 years of covering African Union summits, journalists present had never seen a head of state simply refuse to engage and walk away from such a direct challenge. The symbolism was staggering. Here was one of Africa's most powerful and longest-serving leaders, unable or unwilling to defend his record against the accusations of a man young enough to be his grandson. Social media erupted within minutes. The hashtag Africa Accountability began trending across the continent. Young people from Nairobi to Lagos to Dakar shared clips of Traoré's speech with crying emojis and fire symbols. Opinion was sharply divided. Some praised Traoré as a fearless truth-teller, finally saying what needed to be said. Others condemned him as disrespectful, arguing that African leaders should settle their differences privately, not air grievances before the world. But perhaps the most revealing responses came from ordinary Ugandans themselves. In Kampala's bustling markets, in university campuses in Makerere, in rural villages across the country, people gathered around phones and radios to hear what the young Burkinabe captain had said about their president. And according to reporters on the ground, the reactions were complex, layered with decades of frustration, fading hope, and reluctant recognition. He said what we've been thinking for years. a university student in Kampala told a local journalist, speaking on condition of anonymity. But we can't say it. If we say it, we disappear or get labeled as foreign agents. Maybe it takes an outsider to speak our truth. Within 72 hours of Traoré's speech, 7 other African leaders either directly referenced or obliquely responded to his remarks. Tanzania's president spoke about the importance of term limits and constitutional order. Kenya's deputy president posted a cryptic message on social media about leadership that serves rather than rules. Even South Africa's president, typically diplomatic to a fault, mentioned in a press conference that Africa's liberation generation must remember they fought for the people's freedom, not their own perpetual power. The Ugandan government's response was measured but unmistakably defensive. A statement from State House in Kampala praised President Museveni's decades of service and highlighted various development projects. It referenced Uganda's stability compared to neighbors who had experienced civil wars and coups. It emphasized economic growth figures and regional leadership roles. But notably, it never actually addressed Traoré's specific accusations about stalled progress, corruption, or political repression. Meanwhile, in Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso's capital, Traoré's approval ratings, already high among young people, surged even higher. Street celebrations broke out in several neighborhoods. The captain's image appeared on new murals alongside Thomas Sankara, Burkina Faso's revolutionary hero who was assassinated in 1987. The message was clear. A new generation of African leadership had announced itself, and it wasn't asking for permission. But beyond the drama, beyond the viral videos and passionate debates, Traoré's confrontation with Museveni raises profound questions that extend far beyond Uganda or Burkina Faso. Questions that every African nation must grapple with. Questions that ultimately determine whether the 21st century will be Africa's century or just another era of unfulfilled potential. How long is too long for a leader to remain in power? The answer isn't simple, and different contexts demand different solutions. But when leaders start changing constitutions to extend their rule, when opposition becomes criminalized, when youthful energy is met with state violence rather than engagement, surely we've crossed a dangerous line. What is the responsibility of African leaders to hold each other accountable? For too long, the Organization of African Unity and later the African Union operated on a principle of non-interference that often protected dictators and enabled human rights abuses. Traoré's speech suggests a new paradigm. African leaders calling out African leaders, not to please Western powers or international organizations, but to honor the liberation struggles that brought independence in the first place. And perhaps most importantly, can military leaders who seize power through coups genuinely be agents of democratic progress? Traoré has made bold promises about transitioning to civilian rule, about fighting corruption, about putting people before profits. But history is littered with revolutionary leaders who began with noble intentions and ended as the very tyrants they replaced. Will Traoré be different? Only time will tell. The fact that he's publicly setting standards for himself and others is promising, but promises are wind until they become action. As the dust settles from that extraordinary confrontation in Addis Ababa, one thing is crystal clear. The conversation about African leadership has fundamentally shifted. The old rules of diplomatic courtesy that allowed failing leaders to hide behind sovereignty and seniority are crumbling. Young Africans armed with smartphones and social media are demanding more. They're demanding leaders who deliver, not just leaders who endure. They're demanding progress that can be measured in improved lives, not just speeches and ribbons cut at project launches that never materialize. Ibrahim Traoré's message to Yoweri Museveni wasn't just about one president or one country. It was a message to every leader across the continent. You work for the people, not the other way around. Your legitimacy comes from what you deliver, not how long you've held power. And in this new era of transparency and connectivity, you will be held accountable whether you like it or not. President Museveni has not publicly responded to Traoré's speech as of this recording. His silence speaks volumes. Meanwhile, Traoré has returned to Burkina Faso, where he continues his controversial but increasingly popular campaign to restructure his country's economy, reduce foreign dependence, and build what he calls genuine sovereignty. The question that remains is this: will Traoré's bold stand inspire a new generation of accountable, term-limited, people-focused leadership across Africa? Or will he himself fall into the same trap that has consumed so many revolutionaries before him, trading liberation ideals for the intoxicating drug of unchecked power? So I'm asking you, what do you think? Was Traoré right to publicly challenge Museveni like this? Should African leaders call each other out more often, or should these conversations happen behind closed doors? And most importantly, do you believe someone who takes power through military force can genuinely deliver democratic progress? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Share this video with someone who needs to see it. And subscribe, because we're going to keep following this story as it unfolds. And trust me, this is just the beginning of something much bigger than one speech at one summit. This is about Africa's future, and you deserve to be part of that conversation.